exhibit to have, and I want to thank Richard again for loaning his collection to us, because it's gotten so many people in the museum excited about learning, excited about seeing what we have here, and coming to hear him speak a second time. It's so wonderful. Before we get to his lecture, though, on famous flags in American history, I just want to ask you all to please sign the guest book before you leave. If you'd like to sign up for our email list so you can stay in the loop on what's going on, please do. Or follow us on social media. We have pages on Instagram and Facebook called the Friends of the Lebanon Township Museum. Also, I hope that you take a look upstairs while you're here and check out the new edition if you haven't seen it yet. And of course, after the lecture, join us outside. We're going to have a root beer taste test, which some people are very excited about. And there's also going to be 2 out of 4 children walked in today and didn't say, "Hi, Mom." They said, "I'm hungry." So hold on. You're going to learn a little bit, and then you're going to get some root beer and some root beer floats. And we also have a croquet set and some other things. I just thought that would make a fun afternoon in the yard. Janice Freeman is not here right now. She went out to get some ice cream, but I just wanted to have it on the record that she had the whole idea for the root beer taste test and the floats and everything, and I'm so grateful because I think it adds a really fun element to the afternoon. And Squires Point, who helped host that part of the lecture today. And one last thing, on Saturday, August 3rd from 1 to 4, I hope you all come back. We are celebrating the 20th anniversary of the Ride to Pleasant Grove, written by Sal Vuakulo Jr., who purchased a historic home in the township and then researched it and wrote a book and shared with us everything about farming life in the township, in his home, and then wrote a poem based on what he felt like that person's life was living in the home in that time. So we'll have an exhibit in the museum that is about farm life over the centuries in Lebanon Township. Sal's family will be here on August 3rd from 1 to 4. There will be 2 different readings from the books, and there will be some other events planned as well. So make sure to stay in touch so that you know what's going on. And now I'm going to hand it over to Richard.
Thank you all for coming today. It's a beautiful Saturday afternoon. And the subject today is famous flags, which is one of the things that I enjoy talking about the most, because in some of my lectures I always talk about great moments in history, great events, and the flags that are associated with those events. And to me, that's the essence of what American history is really all about. Now, time does not permit me to go into a discussion on a lot of flags that I would like to have included today. So I'm going to give you a quick thumbnail sketch of some that I'm not able to talk about in any length, but really are worth mentioning. One is the continental colors, which we talked about a little bit on our first lecture. This was the de facto flag of the United States before the Stars and Stripes was born via the Flag Act of 1777. The next is, I hope you can see this, Washington's headquarters flag. This was carried by Washington throughout the Revolutionary War. It was the flag stars are very unusual, long 6-pointed stars, which supposedly Washington designed himself. And as I said, this was with him everywhere in the war. It's presently in the collection of the American Revolutionary War in Philadelphia. I had the privilege a few weeks ago, this flag is no longer on display. I had the privilege a few weeks ago to be taken behind the scenes at the museum, and I saw this flag up close. It's a gorgeous, gorgeous flag, but it's so faded in color that they do not want to bring it out into the light. Yeah.
Dimensions, how big is that, Richard?
The flag is about this big,
Okay.
almost square. The Bennington flag, very unusual, 76, surrounded by an arch of, I believe, 7-pointed stars. Starts with a white stripe. Supposedly carried at the Battle of Bennington, but it was later discovered that it was not. The fabric dates to the early 1800s, probably around the War of 1812. We saw this flag in person many years ago It's at the Bennington Museum in Vermont. If you drive across the river to eastern Pennsylvania, you'll see this flag flying everywhere. This is the Eastern flag, very different and unique. The stars are where the stripes should be, the stripes are where the stars should be. Supposedly, this flag was flown on July the 8th, 1776, when the Declaration of Independence was read in Easton in the town square. That was later disputed as well, because the fabric, again, was dated to the early 1800s. A lot of times that happens, the stories are told, but the evidence later turns out not to be the case. We talked about the Star Spangled Banner flag at Fort McHenry, the inspiration for the words and music of the Star Spangled Banner by Francis Scott Key. Confederate battle flag. This is not the Confederates' national flag. It's their battle flag that often is confused. The problem with this flag in recent history, I don't have to tell you, has brought about a lot of comments because different people see the flag differently. And as a result, there's a lot of controversy about it, and it's being eliminated in a lot of places. Flag flown by carried by Admiral Perry on his trip to the North Pole in April, I think in 1909. You can see patches where fragments of the flag were left behind at different campsites in their expedition. The long stripe down the center was taken out and put in a glass jar and stored at the North Pole in a couple of blocks of ice. It was made by Perry's wife.
Is it still there?
Say again?
Is it still there?
Yes. Yes.
Already melted.
Do they know where it is?
Interesting about Perry because he thought he landed exactly at the North Pole. Later on it was discovered that he was a little bit not exactly at the North Pole. So yes, it's there. The question is, where is it?
Yes.
We talked about this flag, the Apollo 11 landing on the moon, planted by astronauts Buzz Aldrin. And by the way, next week is the 50th anniversary of the landing on the moon. April 20th? Yeah. And lastly, in this segment, POW Missing in Action flag, started by a group in 1970s to kind of bring public attention to those that were missing in action in Southeast Asia. This flag is the only flag other than our national flag that's ever flown over the White House or has been in the Senate Rotunda. Two famous Don't Tread on Me flags. First of all, the rattlesnake and other animals, but particularly the rattlesnake, was a very significant and important symbol during the Revolutionary War. The colonists used that symbol a lot. You may recall from Benjamin Franklin's famous, actually it was a poster that he made, Join or Die, with the segments of the snake. A lot of these things were modeled after that. The first one is the first Navy Jack. I should explain first of all that a Jack is a small flag that's flown on a vertical pole on the bow or front of a ship when the ship is moored or at anchor. So a Navy Jack would be a flag of that sort flown on Navy vessels. The first one supposedly was designed by Isaac Hopkins, who was appointed in 1775 by Congress as the first commander of the U.S. Navy. Some people believe that this particular flag originally did not have the uncoiled snake and the motto, "Don't tread on me." It was simply 13 red and white stripes. And a lot of historians believe that. However, over time, particularly since the late 1800s, that kind of has been disputed, and it appears that this is the original design that Hopkins put forth in 1775. The first Navy Jack has been used in modern times by the U.S. Navy at the discretion of the Secretary of the Navy. For example, during the bicentennial period, the first Navy Jack was hoisted on the bow of every naval vessel. And it was during that centennial period of 1976, and it stayed there for about 2 years. Since then, since about 2002, the first Navy Jack has been flown on Navy vessels in honor of the War on Terror. That recently has been changed. I think it was this past June, where the Navy reverted back to its original Navy Jack, which is 50 stars on a blue field. However, there is one exception, and the exception is, it's tradition in the Navy that the oldest commissioned ship that's still active will fly the first Navy Jack. In this case, it's the USS Blue Ridge, which is the head ship for the 7th Fleet. Excuse me.
How old is it?
Say again?
How old is the ship?
I'm trying to remember when that was commissioned. I can't tell you that.
That design was probably
John,
right
any
after
suggestion?
World War
I'm
II.
sorry?
Right after World War II, I would.
Yeah, I'm assuming like in the 40s. The second Don't Tread on Me flag is the Gadsden flag that was designed by Christopher Gadsden, who was a representative to the Continental Congress in South Carolina. And his idea was to design a flag because in Europe there was a tradition that the commander of the Navy would have his own personal flag. So he designed this for Commodore Hopkins. In the late 1775, Washington and his troops were running low on munitions. So the USS Alfred was sent out on a mission to capture 2 British ships and to gather the munitions that were meant for British troops. And it was very successful in its mission. And it became very successful in lots of missions that they did during the Revolutionary War. On board that ship, that Alfred, were 5 companies of mariners from Philadelphia who took part in all of the warfare with the Alfred. They carried a drum that was painted yellow with a "Don't Tread on Me" motto on it. This group later became known as the United States Marines. And to this day, the Gadsden flag is the symbol of the Marines. I originally didn't plan to include this flag. The truth, did not plan to include this flag or Betsy Ross's story today. But recent events had prompted me really to change my mind. Let me go back to this flag for a second. This is one of the most iconic U.S. design flags. It's an absolutely gorgeous flag. And Betsy Ross herself is an icon of American history. The flag with the 13 stars in a circle represents unity, one not better than the other, all together forming almost a perfect union. Elizabeth Griscom, known as Betsy Ross, was the, I think, 7th or 8th child of 17 children. When she was 21, she married John Ross. I should say, she and John Ross eloped. John Ross was from the Episcopal Church, Betsy was from the Quaker Church, and the families didn't think that they should marry. So they eloped. They were married and went into business in Philadelphia in an upholstery shop. John, a couple of years later, was killed in a freak accident while on militia duty. But Betsy continued to run the business in Philadelphia, and at the same time she began to take on making flags. She married twice again and had 7 daughters from each of her 2 marriages. Second marriage to Joseph Ashburn, and finally to John Claypool. She died at age 84. The interesting thing that I often wondered about, she was married twice, but kept the name Ross. I don't know if it was because that's the way the business was set up and people recognized her name. Probably that's the reason. But I often wondered why she didn't change her name.
Richard, how many children did she have altogether?
Say again?
How many children did she have altogether?
I think 7.
7 total.
7 total, like
Oh, the way you said it, we thought 7 from each husband.
Oh, I'm sorry. I'll have to hear that on playback. Thank you for correcting me. I have a habit of doing that. The interesting thing about Betsy Ross is the story of her and the first American flag really resulted from some discussion she had later in life about how a committee from Congress visited her. There were 3, George Washington, George Mason, and I forget the 3rd gentleman, visited her with a sketch of a flag that they wanted her to make. And she looked at it, and they made a couple of adjustments, changing the 6-pointed stars to 5-pointed stars. And supposedly, according to her, she made the first flag, and it was accepted by Congress. The 5-pointed star thing is kind of interesting because most of the flags from this period were either 6, 7, or 8-pointed. There were never 5-pointed stars. 6, 7, or 8. 6 was probably the most common. In any event, her grandson, William Canby, about a century later, in around 1870, made a talk to the Pennsylvania Historical Society, in which he talked about how his grandmother had told the story of how she sewed the first flag. He said he heard this from his aunt 20 years after Betsy died, and he was only 11 years old at the time. But he recalls all of this, and he goes through this long dissertation. Oddly enough, it gets a lot of attention. In fact, the story is published in Harper's Magazine and in other magazines and textbooks throughout the country, and including the famous painting by Weisker, Birth of Our Nation's Flag. The story of Betsy Ross is important because it was a time in history when we were trying to develop heroes from the Revolutionary War, men and women. Molly Pitcher, there were lots of them. So the Betsy Ross story is important. However, she did not sew the first flag. She did not make the first flag. She did not design the first flag. There's no evidence in any record of Congress that a committee from Congress ever visited her. But nevertheless, the story, the legend has caught on. Betsy Ross was one of a number of flag makers in Philadelphia, but she certainly was and became the most famous. On April the 12th, 1861, Fort Sumter was bombarded by Confederate by Confederate troops. The battle lasted for 30 or 35 hours. There were no casualties, and finally the flag was taken down and the American forces left the fort. The flag was retained by the company commander of the fort, and a couple of weeks later, he brought it to New York City, where a rally was held in Manhattan's Union Square. 100,000 people showed up. And the flag, see at this point it doesn't work on the screen, but the flag was hoisted on the equestrian statue of George Washington. Part of the ways to raise money was they would raffle the flag off, and then whoever was successful in the bid would donate the flag back, and then it would move on to the next city for the next auction, where they auctioned the flag off, and that cycle continued and allowed them to raise money for the Union cause. Almost exactly, I should say, 4 years later to the day, Fort Sumter was recaptured, and General Anderson, the fort's commander, raised the flag again at Fort Sumter. What's good about some things past the Civil War, we actually have photographs. I mean, this is a real photograph, it's not a characterization. Probably one of the most famous nicknames for our flag is Old Glory. And the story of this particular flag is that in 1824, William Driver received a 24-star flag that was made by his mother and some female admirers of him, and was given to him for his 21st birthday. And he took the flag, which he called Old Glory, and he flew it on his ship. And he traveled for the next 20 years throughout the Southeast, China, and that portions of the Pacific. And finally, in the 1840s, he retired from the sea. His wife died, and he moved to Nashville. And at that time, he kept his flag, Old Glory. Sometime later, 10 stars were added to the flag. Went from 24 stars to 34 stars, which would be around the time of the early 1860s. And he also included on the flag an embroidered anchor that he sewed in the lower right-hand corner of the canton. When Tennessee, remember he's in Nashville, when Tennessee seceded from the Union, he took the flag and he hid it in a coverlet. The Confederacy took over Nashville, Tennessee, and he would fly his flag, but he would do it when the Confederacy didn't see it, because he wanted to raise the spirits of the people that were against the Confederate States. When Nashville was again retaken by the 6th Ohio Infantry, I believe, Driver brought the flag out, and he brought it down to the state capitol and helped raise it over the dome of the state capitol. His family retained the flag, and after his death, he was buried in Nashville City Cemetery, and his daughter inherited the flag. And this is where his words, "Mary Jane, this is my ship's flag, Old Glory. It has been my constant companion. I love it as a mother loves her child." cherish it as I have cherished it. The later the flag was donated, it was given to the President Harding, and it was donated to the Smithsonian where it is today. Ford's Theater, April 1965, during a presentation of famous play, Our American Cousin. John Wilkes Booth sneaks into the back of the presidential booth, fires a shot directly into the head of Abraham Lincoln, point blank. As you can imagine, there's chaos throughout the theater. Oops, I went fast. Laura Keene, who was the star of the play, rushes up to the presidential box and, according to the story, places the head of Lincoln in her lap. Thomas Gorley, a stage manager and part-time actor, was also present at the scene. When they were to attend Lincoln, they were about to lay him on the floor so that they could inspect his wounds, when Gorley grabs the flag from the front of the box, folds it, places it under Lincoln's head as he lay on the floor. After a few minutes, they move Lincoln across the street to the Peterson house, where he dies the next morning at 7:22 a.m. Gorley takes this flag, and he and his family hold on to it for the next 20-some years. When he dies, he leaves the flag to his daughter, Jenny Gorley Struthers. Jenny and her sister Maggie, as well as Thomas Gorley, the father, were all part of the crew, all part of the cast that were present at Lincoln's assassination that night. Many years later, Jeannie will tell the story of what happened that evening. The confusion, all of the rigmarole that went on. However, she doesn't mention anything about the flag. After her death, the flag was inherited by her son, Paul, who several years later donates it to the Pike County Historical Society, where it is today. Over the years, there's been a lot of discussion and controversy about the story of this flag and Lincoln and the whole situation. However, several historic groups, experts on Lincoln, have disagreed with the story that I just told you. But there are a number of other groups and experts who agree with the story. And so pretty much now it's determined that they did an analysis of the blood on the flag. It is human blood. They did an analysis of the dyes in the flag. The dyes are representative of what would be there during the Civil War. So it's pretty much been determined now that this is the Lincoln's flag. A controversy occurred a couple of years ago when the director of the Historical Society, a new director was hired. He disagreed with the story. He's no longer the director of the Yeah. And like I said, a lot of times the controversy is something that's gonna go on for a long time. And what's really nice is we have nowadays, the forensics tools to be able to determine some things that we normally couldn't before. Okay. This flag is the flag of the National Women's Party, a women's organization that was founded by Alice Paul and Lucy Burns in 1913. It was a group that fought for women's rights, particularly the passage of a constitutional amendment for women, for giving women the right to vote. And this flag, a gold, white, and purple striped flag, was a symbol of the suffrage movement, and it appeared every place, prominently in parades and other gatherings. Lucy Burns understood that in order for the women's movement to be successful, it really needed the support of the president, which it did not have. So on March the 13th, 1913, she organized a march down Pennsylvania Avenue, demanding women's right to vote. There were about 8,000 marchers who endured all kinds of heckling and violence, but it was a milestone march, and it was part of a movement that was gathering a lot of momentum. Shortly after the march, Congress began to consider an amendment in light of the growing support, and it was primarily due to Paul's aggressive tactics. Eventually, President Wilson reversed his position and supported suffrage. This particular poster was one where he talks about, I guess he was going to go to the poll. He was going to make sure that New Jersey passed the amendment. Finally, Congress passed the 19th Amendment on June the 4th, 1919, and it went to the states for ratification. As you know, it takes 3/4 of the states to ratify the Constitution, to amend the Constitution. As each state ratified the legislation, Paul sewed a star on the tricolored flag, and on August the 18th, 1920, Tennessee voted to pass the amendment by a single vote, and it became the law of the land. Upon the news that the amendment had passed, Alice Paul unfurled her victory banner outside the balcony at the National Women's Party headquarters in Washington. I think we've all seen this. I've talked about it from time to time. This is actually the second flag waving raising on Iwo Jima. Just by way of background, Iwo Jima was an island between Japan and the Marianas Islands, and it provided an excellent point by which the Japanese could notify the mainland, their mainland, when American bombers were coming across the Pacific. So it was a very strategic location, and it was a strategic place. This particular, let's go back to this particular photograph was taken on February the 23rd, 1945, by Joseph Rosenthal, an AP photographer, and it became one of the most important and publicized images of the war. This photograph won the Pulitzer Prize for photography. first flag waving actually occurred a couple of hours before the second flag waving. And a group of Marines, when we landed on the beach, the first objective of the Marines was to take Mount Suribachi, which is that volcano on the southern end of the island. So our first objective was to take that because you could see the troop placements. It was very critical. So when we landed, the first object was to take that, which they did in about 4 days. To take the remainder of the island took another 31 days. This is one of the bloodiest battles in U.S. military history. I believe there were close to 7,000 casualties and about 19,000 wounded. When we secured the island, a group of Marines went up the crater with a flag. They found an iron water pipe. They attached the small flag to that pipe and they raised it over the volcano. The men on the beach seeing this cheered. Men on the boats in the water were cheering. Secretary of the Navy, James Forrestal, happened to be with the invasion force. And he stepped onto the beach just as that first flag was going up. He was so taken by it, by the fervor of the moment, that he asked if he could have the flag as a souvenir. Colonel Chandler Johnson was the commander of the 2nd Marine Battalion, who said, "The hell with that. The Marines fought for this flag. This is our flag, blank, blank, blank. You can fill in the blanks." And he ordered one of his officers to find another flag, to send it up, and bring the first flag down. The officer found, and he said, "By the way, find a bigger flag." An officer did find it on a ship. They gave it to PFC Cagnan, and a small group of Marines went up the crater and gave the flag to Harold, Lieutenant Shire, who had raised the first flag. At the same time going up was Joe Rosenthal with another AP photographer, and he reached the top of Mount Suribachi just at about the time the Marines were ready to raise the flag, second flag. So he had put his camera down, and in doing so, he almost missed the shot because they started to raise the flag. So he quickly grabs his camera, it was laying on the ground, and he shoots the picture without looking through the viewfinder. He later said he didn't know how it was going to come out. He would never know how, a photo like that was going to come out. Well, obviously it came out pretty well. So, and this is the shot of the second. There's controversy once again about who were the 6 men in the photo that raised the second flag on Iwo Jima. Harlan Block was misidentified as PFC Hansen, I believe. And a couple of years later, the Navy finally made an announcement that Block was actually one of the 6 flag raisers. John Bradley, a U.S. Navy corpsman, I believe, was misidentified in place of Harold Schultz. 71 years later, the Navy acknowledged that it was Schultz, not John Bradley, who was one of the 6. You're familiar with the book Flags of Our Fathers? It was written by James Bradley, the son of John Bradley. In that book, James Bradley talks about how his father was one of the 6 flag raisers at Iwo Jima. Interestingly, John Bradley was part of the flag raising group on Iwo Jima, but he was part of the first flag raising. And over the years, when he was asked about, yes, I was there, I raised the flag, either he forgot or whatever, he confused himself, saying he was the second when it really was the first. Of the 6, Strank and Block were killed a couple of days later. Sousley was also killed a few days before the island was finally secured. The 3 remaining Marines, Schultz, Gagnon, and Hayes. Gagnon was, after the war, he opened a travel agency, I believe, and he became the director of a maintenance crew of a large hotel in Manchester, New Hampshire. Schultz was wounded in the stomach and arm and was released. And a few months later, he was discharged from the Marines. He, I believe he became a postal worker. Ira Hayes, probably the most famous of the 6. Ira Hayes suffered from, after the war, of deep depression, became an alcoholic, a sad story. He died at age 32, and his story is memorialized in the movie The Outsider, starring Tony Curtis. The Rosenthal photo, the original, is in the hands of a private collector, and the 2 flags raised are now in the National Museum of the Marine Corps. On December the 8th, the day after the bombing of Pearl Harbor on the 7th, Franklin Roosevelt went before Congress and asked for a declaration of war against Japan. He instructed at that time to not take down the flag that was flying over the U.S. Capitol. It's normal policy during the day to change the flag several times. But he wanted that flag remaining. And it was still remaining about 3 days later when he went back to Congress and declared war on Germany and Italy. He called that flag, he took the flag in his possession, and he called the flag of liberation. And he carried the flag of liberation everywhere he went during the war. When he would visit allies in Europe, he had the flag with him. After his death, the flag was given to President Truman, and he in turn turned it over to Dwight Eisenhower, excuse me, who was the commander of the European forces. The flag of liberation was raised over Berlin when the war ended, and also over Rome. This is a photo from the Berlin flag raising. On August the 2nd, 1945, aboard the USS Missouri, peace agreement with Japan was signed. Flying on the bridge of the USS Missouri that day was the flag of liberation. There was another flag on board ship that day, this flag right here. That flag was on the ship that Admiral Perry flew when he went into Tokyo Harbor in 1853, I believe, which opened up trade with Japan. The flag of liberation is now in the hands of the architect of the Capitol. And it's really not on display anywhere. Every once in a while it comes out for a special occasion. And I talked to the curator there, and she was kind enough to send me a couple of photos of the flag. Growing up in the 60s, I was an adult, but growing up in the 60s is kind of strange to talk about this a little bit, but this flag, this simply stated, can say that it became the symbol of the counterculture movement of many college people who were avoiding the draft. And I don't know any simpler way to put it. You know? But that's how it's, you know, there was a whole nuclear disarmament movement going on in Europe, caught fire in the United States. This particular symbol was on everything. I mean, you couldn't buy a pair of sunglasses, you couldn't buy a hat without the peace symbol. Flags, banners, everywhere. The symbol itself was designed by Gerald Holton. And it was, as I mentioned, part of the campaign for nuclear disarmament. And it really comes from two semaphore symbols. N and D, nuclear disarmament. Put the two together and you have the peace sign. And that's the origin of, that's simply the origin of that. In the United States, it appeared on flags everywhere, and every music festival, every gathering, anti-war gathering, this flag was present. And during the 60s, music was a very integral part of the movement. And probably the most famous of all of the music festivals was this one, Woodstock, 1969. Well, it's coming up on the 50th anniversary of a lot of things. 1,000 acre field up in New York State. They expected about 50,000 people, and 500,000 young people showed up. It was a disaster. There was traffic everywhere, mud, no food, no water. The bathroom facilities were almost non-existent, but everybody had a great time.
Did you go?
No, I was not there. In fact, I was thinking I was going to put a little circle there and say that was probably me. We were married at the time.
I wouldn't let him go.
And she wouldn't let me go. Yeah. This particular peace symbol flag was flown on the stage of Woodstock, and it later turned up in the barn. And it's now in the hands of a collector. So if you missed the first Woodstock, you know, you get a chance in August for the 50th anniversary. It'll be in the Watkins Glen. I took a look at the music of the artists that are very, very different. We talked a little bit about this at the last talk. Someone asked about what happened with the 9/11 flag. And I'd like to talk a little bit about that. I think everybody knows this photo was taken by a Bergen news photographer at Ground Zero. And it instantly, in today's communication, it instantly was flashed around the world. The photo was taken about 5 o'clock in the afternoon, and at 5:01, everybody saw it. The idea to raise the flag on a flagpole was the idea of Dan McWilliams, one of the 3 firemen. The other 2, Billy Eisengrain and George Johnson. And he really came up with the idea to, because he saw a flag on a yacht in New York Harbor. So we decided if we get that flag, we can raise it up, which they did. On September the 23rd, about 2 weeks, about a week or so later, the flag was raised at Yankee Stadium in front of a huge, huge rally of people. And Mayor Giuliani, Governor Pataki, and lots of other celebrities were on hand, and they all signed the flag. And after that, the flag was given to the Navy, and it was put on the USS Theodore Roosevelt, which was on its way to Afghanistan. So it flew that flag on its way to the Far East, to the Middle East. After that, it traveled around the world on countless ships and in countless countries. And it was finally returned in 2012. And when it was returned, Shirley Dreyfus and Spiro Kopalakis, whose yacht, the Star of America, the flag originally was taken from, they asked if they could borrow the flag and get the flag back, because they wanted to have a fundraiser for 9/11, and they then wanted to donate the flag to the Smithsonian. When they received the flag back, they realized it was not the same flag.
No signatures?
It was a different flag that they had given to the firemen. The 3 firemen also attested to the fact that it was not the same flag. The flag that they received was larger than the one that they had originally. So what happened? Would someone take it? Was it misplaced? Was it lost? No one knew. And no one had any clue as to what happened. CNN ran a special program. Excuse me. I want to get the date. I think it was 2013. They ran a program talking about the disappearance of the flag and what happened to it. And they went into a great deal of detail, interviewing people that were, part of the whole story. And after all of their investigation, they weren't able to determine anything. The one thing that they did determine was, from a surveillance camera that the police had at Ground Zero, they went back and looked at the film. The flag was gone a few hours after it was originally raised. Again, did someone take it? No one knew. About a year later, another television program, Lost History, was aired on the History Channel. This time, they offered a $10,000 reward for any information leading to the disappearance of the first flag. As you might expect, 4 days later, a man using the name Brian walked into a firehouse in Everett, Washington, had a plastic bag in his hand. And he said he had seen the show and he believed that he had the flag. And he claimed that he was a former Marine and it had been given to him by the friend of a widow of 9/11. So he handed over the flag to the fireman and he left. No name other than Brian and no information. The Everett Police Department, based on description from the firemen, put out a sketch in the local newspapers asking for help in identifying and finding Brian, but nobody could come up with it. The police department and a forensic expert from the state of Washington did a thorough analysis of the flag that Brian had dropped off. And after a lengthy and rigorous process, and based primarily on the fact that the halyard matched the description, they thought they had enough evidence to determine that this flag was indeed the flag from 9/11. The flag went back to New York, and it was given to Shirley Dreyfus, who said, "This is the flag, yes." And unfortunately, her husband had died a couple of years before, so he wasn't able to take part in the celebration. But she did donate it to the September 11th Memorial Museum. So the final mystery is, who was Brian? And excuse me. Finally, Brian Brown shows up at the police station in Everett and said, "I was the one who gave the firemen the flag." He said he was a military memorabilia collector, and again, it was given to him by someone, and he saw this show on television, Lost Horizon, and he decided to come forward. Initially, he was afraid to. He didn't want to be accused of anything, but he finally felt that he had to step forward. He said he had preserved this flag he had for 8 years in his freezer. So finally now the flag from 9/11 is back in New York at the 9/11 Memorial Museum, and it's at a place where it belongs and everyone can see it. I just kind of want to say in closing that when Gina asked me to do the exhibit here, I think I'm correct, I didn't hesitate, mainly because she's a nice lady. And I always enjoy, letting people have an opportunity to see these flags. Then when I saw the schoolhouse, I stood in that doorway and I could picture exactly what this exhibit was going to look like. And I think with a few changes, it pretty much came out the way we thought. So it's kind of been an honor. I have to say it's been an honor. It's been a lot of fun. And I've met a lot of nice people who have a great interest in history, as I do. And my hope, as I always is when I do these things, is that you've learned something about the national flag. And I hope that you have a greater insight and appreciation for what it represents, mainly the freedoms that we all enjoy. So thank you for being here today. I got a little hoarse, but thank you for being here today, and I'm happy to answer any questions.
Thank you. I have two questions. My first one is, what happened to the second 9/11 flag that was signed by Taki and everybody else? That's my first question. My second question is, the George Washington flag, the one that's no longer available to be seen, who had that, how was that kept all these years until it got to the Philadelphia Museum of the
Yeah, I think the story, what I've read about it, we think it was somewhere in New York City, in the police station, someplace.
Which was the
Second, I hate to say it.
The 9/11 flag is there now?
Which 9/11 flag
The
is?
second one, the one that was signed at the baseball stadium, the one that,
Yes, that flag, we think is someplace, was being held by, someplace by one of the officials in New York.
okay.
I don't know if it was mayor's office or somebody. Where it is, I don't know.
So that's now disappeared.
And see, that flag, interestingly, that flag has some significance.
Yeah,
It does.
right, because it's got signatures, so.
Yeah.
Okay, and then the Washington flag, where was it between the
Oh, okay,
end of the
the
American
Washington
Revolution
headquarters
until,
flag?
yeah,
At Gettysburg National Site.
that's who had it?
I'm sorry, I said Gettysburg, John and I were talking about Gettysburg. I'm sorry,
Valley Forge.
at Valley Forge.
So it's been in Valley Forge since the end of the
When the
American
Museum of the American Revolution was about to open, all of the stuff from the Valley Forge Museum was shipped over
Got it.
to the new museum. And I told you I had an opportunity to go downstairs and see stuff. And they just got stuff all, it was fantastic. They've got, John, you would appreciate, they have rifles that are out of sight. And great graphics, I mean, it's just a beautiful museum. Yes, Barbara.
Is there a significance of the, don't tread on me, the one with the coiled snake, is there a significance of the yellow background?
No, I don't know about, I don't know, maybe just look, I don't know, no. There is an interesting thing about how one is uncoiled and one is coiled. And the uncoiled one is basically, which was probably the first one of the two, was be careful, don't step on me, I'm okay, but just be careful what you do. The second one is definitely,
Ready to strike.
Stay away. yeah. Now, I don't know why yellow, no, I don't know. Marine colors are that, you know, that red and yellow, gold.
Just,
Yeah. Yes, sir. Were you just stretching or asking me a question?
I'm stretching.
Yes, Artie.
If I recall properly, and I may not, at one of your other talks with respect to the 9/11 flag on the ship, you, after all was said and done, if my recollection serves me, to repeat myself, you expressed some skepticism that the found flag was really the flag. You don't seem to have that, you seem to have changed your mind since then, and I'm wondering if my perception is real, what has occurred to make you change your mind?
Okay. I have not changed my opinion. My opinion in public is different than my let me explain that. The flag that came off the yacht that was raised on Ground Zero is a 3x5 flag, a nylon flag. You can buy 10,000 of them. I'm sure there were 5,000 in New York City that day. My skepticism always has been the flag that came back from Everett, Washington, seemed to be in really good condition. If it was flown all these places, you'd think it'd have a lot more wear. The other thing, and I haven't been able to find it, when I first started doing research on this many years ago, there was a story about, I didn't get into it, so you have to understand that time does not allow, I should say, to go into a lot of detail. There's a story about a woman and her husband who worked on the yacht for years. Her husband did a lot of maintenance. There was more than times when the flag was patched. She didn't. She was only 70 or 60% sure that was the flag. I just question that it could be the flag because so many other flags could fit the description. Now they went through an analysis. There were a few tears, but I don't know. My personal opinion is a little different than the story I'm trying to tell. I think it has a happy ending. People are happy with it.
Okay.
Yeah, a lot of these things. I did not have an opportunity to see the flag up inside. I have naturally a little skepticism and everything. Yes. Oh, look who's here.
Just to add, I looked up the USS Blue Ridge,
Yeah.
and it also is from 1969. just to complete the everything, 50-year anniversary.
Yeah, that's what's great about having phones, I talk about information. Anybody else?
So was there a first American flag? I mean,
Yes, there was, and if you were at my first talk, I want to say these two ladies came from Maplewood today. Yes, there was. We think it was pretty much determined that Francis Hopkinson signed it. There's a little question about what it looked like, but basically, yes, there was a first flag. Yeah.
okay.
The first real flag was this Continental Colors, the Grand Union. That was really the first flag that was raised, became part of our history. But the first Hopkinson flag is came out of the Flag Act.
I'll let her borrow your book.
Sorry.
Flag.
And Hopkinson was from,
I'm sorry?
he's from New Jersey.
Oh, yeah. He was a signer. Hopkins was one of the 5 signers from New Jersey. Actually was in Pennsylvania most of the time, but he came to New Jersey. He was a member of the Continental Congress from New Jersey, one of the 5 signers. Yes, thank you.
I was not at the first session, so excuse if this is a repeat
Oh, you missed a
question.
lot. They tell me it's on YouTube.
I'm wondering if the glass on these old flags here, is that a special protective glass so they don't get much?
That's caring for these is a science in itself, and not an inexpensive science. No, what I mean by is you can go down to the store and buy, stuff and put prints on. This is special. It's acid-free. The mat board is acid-free. The glass in some cases is glass. In other cases, it's plexiglass. It's all UV protected. In the case of real glass, the flag is not touching the glass. There's a spacer. In the case of plexi, in most cases, it is touching the flag.
Why is that?
There's a whole,
Why is that?
conservation is a whole separate issue. And it's important that it be done right.
Somebody just
This
said,
flag, let me see which, I don't think it was, oh, no, it's not here today. Several times when I bought flags that were already framed, a disaster. And take them apart, sometimes they were stuck to the paper on the back. It's meticulous to clean them.
how many have you collected over the years?
How many what?
How many have you collected over the years?
Over 300.
Wow.
Don't have that many now, but at one point over 300.
Wow.
I'm trying to, Harry, like you, we're trying to get rid of stuff.
And you know the history of each one?
Yes.
Richard, somebody asked why would you use glass as compared to plexiglass on different
Oh, okay.
flags?
For one, the Plex is a little cheaper. And sometimes when you get something too big, glass is just not
And it's
not
heavier.
practical. So anything that's plexi, I would not want to go anything, actually I would never go glass that big. This one here is about the biggest I'd go with glass. But you're taking a chance with glass versus plexi. There's a little difference in price, but mainly it's the size. Glass, nowadays they have this museum glass. In fact, this here has got museum glass in it. It is absolutely no reflection. It is crystal clear. But it costs a fortune. Fortunately, someone did that for me. Yeah, yes.
If you go to the Pike Museum now, up north, they have the Lincoln flag in a different case that I believe the Smithsonian paid for. It's climate controlled, it's rolled, every so many days to limit its exposure. The preservation of it is as fascinating as the flag.
Which is interesting, it's one of the reasons I collect parade flags, which are smaller flags, versus large flags. I mean, I've had opportunities to buy some great large flags, but I haven't done it. Simply because the smaller flags could be conserved easier by being framed. You get into these large things, she'll tell you, we have quilt collection. They've got to, you got to take them out, refold them, got to put, the tissue in between. It's a lot of maintenance on large textiles. So I stayed with these because I could display them, and they were manageable in terms of conservation. Yes, sir.
Of the flags you got shown here, which is your favorite?
That's like, which is your favorite child?
Well, now one of the bags, I tell you, is one of my favorites, if not the favorite. That was the first flag. I love this flag here. It was given to a little boy for his birthday present.
That's mine.
I love the Harrison flag, this one. I wouldn't have it if I didn't like it. So, if you have 3 children or 4 grandchildren, which one is it? I can't choose. I like them all, but certain ones have certain sentimental value that may put them as a picture. Yes.
Do these decorate the walls of your home?
Yeah. I've got a lot of spaces where my office is and down the hall. If you saw the video, most of these flags, I think all of them are up.
Really?
So I'll be glad to get them back next week.
Must have dark places where they were, right?
No. They're not in any place where there would be enough light to change the color of the wall.
You were saying a lot of them your flags have the personal stories to go with them.
Yeah.
I always love this story. You know which one I'm going to cover. Our goosebump flag.
Well, that one back there.
Yes. You going to tell that story? It's incredible.
I guess so.
She's talking about the flag on.
The one with the little notes.
Oh, yeah.
I should explain to you that I think what's made my collection, which is a little different than others, what makes my collection kind of special is not only am I interested in different star patterns, but I collect flags that have stories to them. I love the social history, the story behind the flag. I love researching the story. So this particular one is we used to go to a lot of antique shows on practically every weekend. And we'd go to early buying, and at 6 or 7 o'clock in the morning, before everybody else shows up, and you're paying double the amount of money to get in, so you get there first. Well, we're up in Wilton, Connecticut, and it was about 7 o'clock in the morning, parked the car, and walking up from the parking lot to my friend flag dealer's booth, which I always went to first. And this flag was hanging on the wall. And I looked at it. It was not framed like this. It was kind of framed, but not like this. But anyway, I looked at it. I loved the flag, and I started to read the little note. And I was so taken back, and Barbara was as well. What makes this flag so unique and different and special is this note. And I could picture what was happening in 1865. The note says, they are singing to my flag at a torchlight parade of Lincoln's men with their pickaxes and spades in 1865. As I stood on my porch, waving this flag, the company of men opposite the house turned and saluted my flag and sang "Rally Round the Flag, Boys." That gives you goosebumps. right? So this is the Goosebumps flag for that reason. It's such a poignant story. Can you imagine this lady waving this flag and these soldiers are out there and they turn?
And
So-
she thought enough to memorialize it in the note and tuck it away.
Yeah, yeah. And interesting, there's a mistake in the note, which I often find. Any, yeah, sorry.
Since
Did I answer your first question?
you certainly did, brilliantly, and very evasively, but brilliantly.
I always have a lot of politics.
One of the most amazing stories, and you haven't discussed it in the last, that I heard you say, that you haven't discussed it the last two lectures, but you did bring up Lincoln, you did bring up the Ford Theater and the flag, but you once told a story at one of your talks about the connection between the Lincoln family and the Booth family, and I think that everyone would be fascinated to hear it.
Okay. I don't have any of the photos with me, but
They have to train.
there's another talk that I do. It's called there's more to the story. And I've taken lots of events in history and kind of expanded them. So like the 9/11 story today, the Iwo Jima story today, where you talk a little bit more about, you see the photo, but you don't really know anything about it other than it's a photo. There's a story that at a train station in Jersey City, and in late 1863 or early 1864, there were a group of passengers waiting to get on the train, and they were standing in line waiting to buy tickets to, I guess, the sleeping car. And in line was a young student going home to Washington from Harvard, and there was another gentleman who was on his way back to Virginia. And they were lined up, waiting to pay the conductor, and all of a sudden, the train, for no good reason, starts to move. Well, what happened was, everybody was kind of shaken. The young man from Harvard fell against the train and then fell down between the train and the platform, that little space, onto the tracks. Could have been killed. All of a sudden, an arm reaches down, grabs him by the coat, pulls him up onto the platform to safety. Save the young man's life. The passengers got on the train and made their way to their destination. As it turned out, the young man who fell down in between the tracks and was saved was Robert Lincoln, the son of Abraham Lincoln. He was on his way home to Washington. The gentleman that reached down and pulled him to safety was Edwin Booth, the older brother of John Wilkes Booth.
Isn't that interesting?
This is a true story. Several months later, no one knew who was who. Although Robert Lincoln mentioned later on that he recognized Booth because Booth himself was a famous actor along with his brother. Several months later, a group from the White House visited Edward Booth to thank him for what he had done. And then they told him who it was. So it's kind of an interesting story. In the talk that they do, we go on to talk a little bit more about Booth and some other things. The Booth, the John Wilkes Booth history is fascinating And if you're a conspiracy lover like I am, I mean, you can get it, some of it is really good. So that's the story that you want to do.
Is there a novel about, I mean, not novel, is there a book about it?
No, but it's a well-known, it was in the newspaper, it was a well-known fact. It is definitely a true story.
No, I mean about the conspiracy. There's many books about it.
Lots of them. Lots of them. I don't want to get into that. No, I mean, I just love the conspiracy. You know, Booth got shot, you know. Anything else? Thank you again. I appreciate